It's Wednesday, January 27th, 2021, and this is another socially distant edition of KBIA's Views of the News. It's your weekly conversation on media behaviors. I'm Amy Simons in the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. My Missouri School of Journalism colleagues, Ernest Perry and Kiely, are joining me today through the magic of Skype. Hi to you, Kathy.
Hello down there, Amy.
Hello, and hi, Ernest.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. Good to check in with both of you on our program this week.
Rebuilding trust with the American people will be central to our focus in the press office and in the White House.
There's a new tone coming out of the White House briefing room where reporters ask questions and get answers, or at least the promise of answers, on a daily basis. It feels like a return to normalcy. Is it? Or are we just in a honeymoon period?
One of my favorite people, and it's been over 2 years since she's been with us.
One of television's most storied interviewers, Larry King, has died. We'll look back on his work at CNN and later on overnight television and streaming online. And the story behind the meme that has the entire internet talking. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well. But I want to start with an interesting initiative that's underway in Boston at the Boston Globe, where this week people have now had the opportunity and the ability to petition the paper's editors and apply to have stories about them reviewed and potentially anonymized or having their names unpublished from those stories. Ernest, the idea behind this is to try and help people clean up their digital footprints, to have coverage of petty crimes or mugshots which live online well past a sentence is complete, so that actions from decades ago don't follow them forever.
This is something. This is an initiative that's been going on for quite some time. And I can tell you that as a former police reporter, these were the kinds of stories that usually would only get maybe about 4 or 5 paragraphs, but those 4 or 5 paragraphs of the people who are actually in those stories really matter, because oftentimes they were small petty crimes, and even in some cases people were charged, but then the charges were dropped, or they were arrested and then but never charged, but the stories wound up in the newspaper and they stayed in the newspaper and they were never corrected. And so there was always this sort of connection between the individuals and the stories that never really were fleshed out or were brought to their conclusion. And now people are really pushing to have their names, in some ways you could say, expunged from this official record, being the newspaper.
So, Kathy, this isn't really something that's new. There have been other organizations that have been trying to do similar things. Why is it, do you think, that we're talking about Boston so much more than some of these other cities' newspapers that have tried to do it maybe on a slightly smaller scale?
Well, I think it is the scale and the fact that it is a major metropolitan newspaper with a very storied history. Mm-hmm. The Boston Globe is the paper that broke the spotlight story and brought down a lot of officials of the Catholic Church. So this is it's a real powerhouse newspaper. I will say, I think this is, but as you point out, this is an outgrowth of a movement that's been going on for some time. And in Europe, the EU has actually enacted legislation called the Right to be Forgotten, which is pretty tough. I mean, it gives the people who are the subject of these stories a pretty wide latitude to remove their names. I've got to say I have some very mixed feelings about this. This started to percolate up a number of years ago, and it first came to my attention when I was a trustee of my college newspaper. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty much like clockwork. I would get a call, usually in the spring, at the time people are applying for jobs, from one of the student editors who would say something like, I just got a call from an alum, a recent alum, who is looking for a job, and the first thing that comes up in the Google search is the arrest for some goofy act of public drunkenness. And I took a pretty hard line no, that you couldn't take those things out, because when you start to rewrite history, mm-hmm. Who gets to decide whose story gets taken down and whose doesn't? And I think it puts you in a very awkward position. What Earnest says, I think, it's compelling too. The one difference is that back when Earnest and I were covering cops, those 2 or 3 paragraph stories would go in, as we called it, the morgue, the library, and very few people saw them. It's much easier to find these things now. But to me, this is a very fraught question, and I think we need to talk about it. We have an RJI fellow working on this subject, and I'm glad looking into it.
So, Kathy, the example that you brought up was about a relatively recent grad looking for a job. I try to think of this in some ways as a diversity and an equity issue, too, is we've looked at patterns of law enforcement and the jailing of Black and brown people for most of them, there is life after incarceration, and the people who have been most heavily affected by this and have the deepest of the digital footprints are some who may have served time under unjust drug enforcement policies of the 80s or the 90s, early 2000s. How do you respond to that ethical question, Earnest?
Well, I mean, that is the difficult question because, again, it goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, oftentimes people are they're arrested on certain crimes. We report on that, and sometimes they're charged and sometimes they're not. Sometimes those charges are dropped, or they may have been arrested on a high-profile charge, but then they were actually, maybe convicted on a lesser charge. That never gets followed up. So that becomes a part of that digital footprint that follows them for a long time and does hamper their ability to be able to move forward or to start a new life. And as you pointed out, back during the heyday of the war on drugs, there are a lot of people caught up in that, and it has impacted their lives, and it still impacts their lives to this day, for what now we would consider to be minor drug offenses.
Well, and the war on drugs happening really at its heyday at the birth of the internet, where those archives began to live online in ways that they may not have been accessible when we were simply printing a newspaper every day that then went to a morgue, that library that we would call the morgue.
Right, absolutely.
I hear everything you both are saying, but I want you to think about this too. And that is, it's going to be influential people who get to go to the newspaper and say, my kid was arrested for drunk driving, get rid of that. I mean, and that's what I worry about here. And I'm not saying, I don't think it's a black and white issue, but I think that the danger of people who have connections and have privilege being able to expunge their records and other people not is very real.
Isn't that where the editorial process comes in there, though? Isn't that why it's an application and a review process?
Well, but one of the things, I think Kathy brings up a good point. Kathy brings up a good point. One of the things that bothers me about this is that the onus is on the person to actually do it and not necessarily the newspaper. And she's absolutely right. So now people of privilege will have the ability to do that, whereas if someone who doesn't, they would just, they miss out on a job. They may not even know that the reason they missed out on the job was because something that happened in their past came up in a Google search as opposed to something that they put on their application. So Kathy brings up a very good point. The question becomes, who's culpable for that? Is it the person or is it the news organization? Under the EU plan, it's the news organization. Whether or not we have something like that here in the States, that's going to be awfully difficult to see what the EU is doing happening here.
The Washington Post faced some criticism this week for memory holing a story that it published last year, a profile of Vice President Harris's sister Maya. Kathy, fill us in on what happened here.
Well, this was a case, the story had been published, written in one way originally when it was published. And as I understand it, the Post repackaged, which is very typical for newspapers. They were doing some sort of an inaugural special, and they repackaged some of their copy to fill up this special section. It's a way newspapers have of making money, and we're all for that. But in the course of doing it, they changed the lead of the story, meaning the way the story opens, and did so in a way that some people questioned. They thought they softened up the lead, and I actually thought they made the lead worse. I'm not sure there was any nefarious intention to it, but I thought they took a vivid lead and made it bland, which editors sometimes do. But it caused a lot of controversy because some people saw conspiracy behind it, thought they were trying to make Vice President Kamala Harris's sister look better than the original story did.
Well, and so, Earnest, that initial paragraph, which people can read on our links blog, is a tremendous piece of writing. The fact that they changed it to kind of soften what was kind of seen as colorful language with maybe some minorly, well, I don't know if I want to say minorly, with some allusions to life in prison, by softening that and then changing it back, what does that do?
Well, I mean, it's one of those moments where, and this is something that that President Biden, for most of his political career, found himself in these situations all the time, making a gaffe, saying something off the cuff that would then be picked up by a reporter and put in the newspaper, and then he would have to answer to it. And I think this was, if listeners want to go and read it on the links blog, they can. It was one of those classic ones where she was trying to make a point, but she used basically something from jail or from prison to make this sort of humorous point. And now I won't say everything, but a lot of what is said either by the president or the vice president or some political figure or one of their surrogates is open season in the partisan wars that has now become our politics and in many ways almost our everyday life, especially within the news media ecosystem.
So, Kathy, bring this back to the debate we were just having about what's going on in Boston. We're talking in the other situation about private citizens who have been covered in the news. Here we're talking about a then presidential candidate. Does that make this an even more egregious act to do it in the first place, that we're talking about a public figure?
Well, I mean, you can see what happens when you change the historical record. Mm-hmm. You know, people automatically go to motivation. Was the person, the editor here, trying to take out a potentially offensive joke, thereby making a political figure look better or not as bad? My guess is no, or my guess is maybe the editor was less worried about how Kamala Harris or her sister looked and more worried about offending the audience, right? But still, when you change the historical record, particularly in this time when there is so much suspicion of institutions, it's immediately going to raise a red flag. And, to Earnest's point, I just want to say, as somebody who loves words, I really hate to see political people or writers or anyone kind of language being shut off from them. I mean, really what Kamala Harris was doing there was using a very vivid metaphor, and it was a very legit metaphor, but because of the times in which we live, you can't express yourself with any kind of color. I really hope we don't bland down our society to the point where we can't be at all vivid in our language.
But I think we have gotten to that point where if you're going to be out on a public stage, you have to be very, very careful, because everything you say, everything you do is going to be looked at within this partisan polarized lens. And in many ways, and when I say we, I'm talking about the news media, are, we contribute to that in the way in which we cover and we highlight these certain things.
So reporters who have been covering the Biden-Harris administration this past week are finding themselves adjusting, covering a very different president with a very different attitude toward the Fourth Estate. Here's how Press Secretary Jennifer Psaki led her first briefing.
We talked about the importance of bringing truth and transparency back to the briefing room. And he asked me to ensure we are communicating about the policies across the Biden-Harris administration and the work his team is doing every single day on behalf of all American people. There will be times when we see things differently in this room, among all of us. That's okay. That's part of our democracy, and rebuilding trust with the American people will be central to our focus in the press office and in the White House.
So, Kathy, these daily press briefings are back. Most of them have been televised live on cable television, in addition to on C-SPAN. A testament there to the desire for transparency. What else have you seen in the past week that you like coming out of the White House press office?
Well, I'll say two things. One, how nice that Joe Biden did not claim to have the largest crowd ever at his inaugural, given COVID. But I guess he could have tried. The other thing I'll say is I don't watch the press briefings, and I don't watch the press briefings for a reason. I used to cover them, and to me, it's like watching paint dry. I love my newspaper. I love the fact that somebody who used to be me will sit through the 30-minute or 60-minute briefing and boil it down and tell me what was the important stuff that I really need to know from that briefing, and I can read it in 5 minutes or less. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what journalists do, and I'm very grateful for that. But I do think the fact that they're back to a regular communication, that reporters are able to get into that room and ask questions and have an exchange of views is really important. It's not just important for the reporters and the readers and the listeners and viewers they serve, but it's important for the administration, because the questions reporters ask tend to be the questions that people have on their minds. And so that's kind of a first gut check for the administration to hear what people are thinking about. So I think just having that exchange and it's a room full of people who will challenge the administration, not be sycophants, that's very important and healthy.
So that challenge is important, and there has been almost this giddy sense of like, they're back, they're answering our questions, they're talking to us again. But Earnest, why do I feel like we need to be, and again, the we being the news media, a bit more guarded about this, to remember that there is supposed to be a bit of an adversarial relationship between the press and the administration in order to maintain that watchdog status?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to get there. Everyone right now at this point, and I say everyone, I'm talking about the Biden administration and his communication team and the reporters are trying to get a feel for what this is going to be like, because there was so much chaos. I mean, it was chaos to the point where no one wanted to even be in that room. Trump's team didn't want to be in there. The reporters didn't want to be in there. There was so much vitriol going on. So now that's been taken away. And now everyone's trying to figure out, okay, are we going to go back to what it was like under Obama? Or is this going to be something new and different? And they're trying to feel each other out at this particular point. So I think you're going to go back to that give and take that you've seen. What that actually looks like is what they're trying to negotiate right now on both sides.
But I want to enter to just sort of go back up to a point Earnest made earlier. I think what the Trump administration has really taught us is what happens when you focus relentlessly on gotcha journalism. And I think, to a certain extent, the couple of administrations prior to Trump, whether they were Republican or Democrat, there was this focus. And one of the bad things about the televised briefings is it kind of encourages reporters to grandstand and look like, oh, I'm being really tough. And sometimes that's appropriate, but sometimes it's not. And I think if you are so corrosive and cynical and constantly suggesting that public officials are terrible people who have ulterior motives that don't have the public interest in mind all the time, it creates an attitude that frankly produces a Donald Trump. And so I hope we recalibrate. I hope that the Trump administration has taught all of us to recalibrate, both public officials and the press. And I think, as Earnest says, it's going to take a while, but we'll get there. But I hope we don't go back to total 100% cynicism and running down everything that a public official says.
Okay. In a career that spanned more than 60 years, Larry King did more than 60,000 interviews questioning some of the biggest names in pop culture, politics, sports, and entertainment.
Do you pinch yourself saying, how did all this happen to me?
How old were you when you said, I'm going to run for office?
You're talking about the cream of the crop. Did you ever say to yourself, I'm an alcoholic?
Yes.
King died Saturday at the age of 87 in a Los Angeles hospital. Ernest, what was it about his interview style that was so successful that led to that kind of longevity?
I think one of the things, and there are a lot of people who've said this, is that he would ask the questions that many people wanted to have asked and answered. And he asked them in a way that would get genuine, authentic answers from the people he were interviewing. And it didn't come across as if, going back to something that Kathy had just mentioned, it wasn't adversarial. I don't ever remember seeing an interview that Larry King did where he came across as being adversarial. And I think because of that, he was able to get people to open up and say things on the air that they wouldn't necessarily say to anyone else because he just didn't come across that way.
I will say there was a clip that I found, he may not have gotten adversarial, but there was a clip I found yesterday in preparing the show where he asked Jerry Seinfeld if the Seinfeld show had been canceled or if he was walking away, and Seinfeld went off on him like, do you know who I am? Do you know that we're the #1 show? And one of the things that Larry King has been noted for since his passing was that when he did interviews, his means of preparing was to not prepare, that
Right.
he let his curiosity drive those discussions, and most of the time it worked for him.
Yeah, but I want to say when he says not prepare,
Yeah.
he was a good newsman. And so it wasn't like he didn't know who Jerry Seinfeld was or what that show was all about.
Sure.
Jerry Seinfeld walked onto the set. So I hear what you're saying. He didn't over prepare.
Yeah.
And so there was a spontaneity to his conversations. But I'm thinking about this because I'm teaching a class right now to young journalists. And I've told them in the class that when they do interviews, they should think less like Mike Wallace and more like Paul Pepper. And Paul Pepper.
And do they know who both of those men are?
Well, they do now because
very
we have
good.
videos of them up. We have videos of them on the website.
Yeah.
So yes. But I think to Ernest's point.
Yeah.
Being able to elicit a response is really what King did. And he was just, you didn't know what he was going to ask you. And I thought that's what made the interview so fresh and lively.
So when he left CNN in 2011, that wasn't the end. It wasn't even close to the end. He was working straight up until his death last week with interviews being posted on YouTube. I always found it really fascinating, the different places that he ended up post CNN. Among them, RT America, which we've talked about many times, is the Kremlin-run television outlet that is on cable news here in the United States.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
it
there's
was-
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ernest. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, yeah, he wound up in some of the most strangest places. But here's the thing. He was still visible and people could find him. And even though he may have been on these these obscure places, he was still able to get the interviews. The people the individuals would still sit down in front of his microphone and in front of him and talk to him in the same way they did when he was on CNN.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a little bit mixed feelings about that. I think there's such a thing as staying too long. And I think too many people in the media don't know when to retire. And it's dangerous. It gets dangerous.
On that note, NBC announced that Tom Brokaw is officially retiring from the network after 55 years. I'm going to admit I didn't realize it hadn't already happened. But Kathy, I'm guessing there were some people who were asking where the network's elder statesman was last Wednesday, missing such a landmark moment in our nation's history.
Well, and that may be why they announced the retirement. I think probably, Amy, he was effectively retired and maybe people were asking about it. And so they made this announcement. I think, there's one thing, especially in the television media, people become personalities and they're known quantities. And I think that's great. But it also makes it very hard for managers and the personalities themselves to know when to quit. And this is a hard job. as you know, we're public figures just like the politicians Earnest was talking about. And it's a stressful job. And I don't think it's a job that people should stay on into their 80s, number one. Number two, we have all these young journalism students, and I want them to have jobs. So I think it's good for people to retire when the time comes.
Okay.
Well, yeah, you have to think about, Tom Brokaw. He's the last of that generation. So I don't think you're going to see in television or any other news medium someone who has a stature for that long a period of time to where when they decide to retire, that's going to be big news.
Okay. Before we go, I can't let the Bernie Sanders mitten meme pass us by without at least a mention. The now iconic photo of the Vermont senator looking like someone's warm but bored grandpa sitting in a folding chair at the inauguration wearing mittens upcycled from a bulky old sweater. The photo, which was made by a Mizzou graduate, has been photoshopped thousands of times, if not more, placing Sanders everywhere from, I don't know, sitting on top of the columns here at Mizzou to department stores to outside of shopping malls or even the Jameson whiskey plant. One of my favorites that we even do have a chance to show it to you now. It was edited into a scene from The Big Bang Theory with the gang eating dinner and Sheldon telling Leonard Bernie was in his spot. Ernest, what has been your favorite Bernie meme?
That one, I saw that one earlier, and that is probably my favorite.
Isn't that one clever?
That's the clever one. The Muppet one.
We got one from the Muppets?
It was interesting
one.
because I saw he was on not Face the Nation, I'm sorry, Meet the Press on Sunday, and he's embracing it. Bernie Sanders is embracing this and basically saying, hey, if you use this in a T-shirt or whatever, we're going to take the funds and we're going to give it to a Vermont organization that does Meals on Wheels and other meals for the elderly. So I think this is really great.
Kathy, have you had a favorite? Maybe one you've seen go by on the screen here or something else that hasn't yet?
My favorite is the one that our students did of Bernie on the set at KOMU. So I really like that one. And we have one of him sitting under the arch of the J School. You shall be bearers of the light. So this has given a lot of imaginative Photoshoppers hours of fun, and all of us hours of fun. And I too, like Ernest, think that Bernie is just a viral media genius. He knows how to roll with it, and he knows how to capitalize on it. So for a socialist, he's capitalizing pretty well. Good for him.
Very, very quickly, Ernest, your thoughts on the idea of some of these brands. We've been seeing some from Smile Direct Club. I mentioned Jameson's whiskey. WikiHow on how to stay warm in cold weather. Any risk as a brand using a polarizing political figure in messaging?
I think in this context, no, because I think when everyone saw it at the inauguration, they were all sort of going like, Bernie's basically couldn't be president, but he could do this and he could take this over. So I think, it'll play out. But for right now, I think it's fine.
Okay. Well, that music means we are out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. We invite you to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Our handle on Twitter is @ViewsOnKBIA. You can also download our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave comments, questions, see previews of next week's program, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.